Summer, 1943, Bay of Biscay, the grey water running like hammered lead under a hard sky. On the surface, a Type 7 rides low to spare its batteries, bridge watch straining for anything that is not sky or sea. U-boat arm, under Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. On one side, RAF Coastal Command, under Air Chief Marshal John Slessor, on the other. And between them, only the short measure of time that decides who writes the report. The call comes thin and edged with certainty from the bridge aircraft. Then the word that matters most, drilled into muscle and bone, since Baltic training cruises alarm. Boots hit steel. Hatches bite shut. The captain drops through the hatch and throws his weight into the ladder well as the coxswain hauls the planes and the bow dips. Valves spin, tanks flood the hull, shudders as if the ocean has grabbed it by the nose. Men count without numbers, because they already know the math about 30 to 45 seconds to periscope depth on a well-drilled boat, a few more to blunt the danger, and the bombs will try to arrive inside that window. Above them, a Coastal Command aircraft is already low, already committed wave-top height and closing. By day there is no Leigh Light, no sudden white sun to blind the bridge crew, only the purposeful shape and the discipline of a shallow-set pattern thrown not at where the submarine was, but where its dive path must go. The first splashes trace a fence across the curve of the crash-dive strings left and right bracketing the arc, the centre timed for the bow as it knifes down. Inside the control room, the angle steepens. Loose gear sings, a coffee mug, skates someone, mutters hold her, and someone else bites his lip and tastes iron. The captain wants depth bearing silence. The ocean wants to turn momentum into safety before shock reaches steel. Pumps, thrum gauges twitch, the periscope standard hums like a tuning fork in a storm. On other nights in this same sea, the approach is worse. Radar pins the contact. The Leigh Light robs the first 10 seconds that keep men alive. But this is a day attack, a clean geometry problem with dirty edges. The sea lifts tall under the pattern, the air tastes of salt and explosive, and the hull is still in the dangerous envelope where timing rules everything. The window was never a promise. It is a race, and the finish line is only seconds wide. By mid-1943, the surface dash across the Bay of Biscay has become the U-boat war's necessary risk. The boats must enter or leave their French bases. The bay is the throat they cannot avoid. The German side knows the timing drill, cruising on the surface to save batteries. Bridge watch layered for distant specks, crash dive on contact, pass periscope depth in about half a minute, reach a safer layer in a handful of breaths. More. That is the script. What changes in 1943 is that the Allies start writing to the same tempo and then cutting it shorter. Coastal Command's problem had always been time. A surfaced submarine is a low target that can vanish in seconds, and the old method, sighting late, attacking high, setting deep, let too many boats slide under the bombs. Radar began to change that in 1942. Better radar changed it decisively in 1943. Now an aircraft could fix a contact, hold it, and shape an approach that arrived at precisely the moment the captain on the conning tower shouted, "Alarm!" The geometry followed. If a Type 7 needs roughly 30 seconds to reach periscope depth and more seconds to move into safer water, then the bomb pattern must arrive, as the hull is still in its dive arc, still committed to the curved path. From surface to shallow. Shallow settings, tight spacing, low release, force the boat to meet the pattern while it is still inside that first minute. At night, the method grew a new edge. The Leigh Light kept dark until the last breaths of the run erased the gap between radar contact and visual confirmation. When the beam snapped on at a few hundred yards, the bridge crew's eyes were stolen. The first 10 seconds burned away in shock and blindness, and the pilot could fly a line that made the timing even crueler. Those were the nights when the window shrank from a fighting chance to a reflex test, and often the pattern itself was not the end. If the boat bled noise in the top layers, props cavitating under rushed angles, an acoustic torpedo could be dropped to listen and finish what the blast had started. By day, the tools were different, but the math was the same. There was no beam to blind anyone. There was instead the discipline of very low, very fast runs and ordnance set to explode, where a diving hull must pass, not where a surface wake used to be. Crews, trained to throw fences across the crash dive pathway, a string to the left of the predicted curve, a string to the right, the center time to greet the bow as it knifed down. The purpose was not simply to hit steel, it was to own the seconds, own 30 to 45 seconds, and you own whether the boat lives long enough to choose depth and bearing. The Germans adapted where they could. Bridge watches were tightened, ready status for crash dive became a kind of permanent posture. Some captains tried stay up and fight with twin 20 seconds and 37 seconds when the aircraft arrived too late for a safe dive on a calm sea. Others experimented with zigzags on the surface to break the attack run before the shout. But these were tactical wagers, placed against a clock that was no longer theirs. When the sea was rough, or the boat heavy with fuel and provisions, the dive was slower. When the crew was green, the timing slipped. When the bridge watch hesitated, everything slipped. And when the attack came out of a bright sky at wave-top height, even a perfect drill could still fail, simply because the pattern was already falling into the path the hull had to follow. The Bay of Biscay became the proving ground. Contacts stacked up. Some were night stories with a white circle of light and a roar that swallowed voices. Some were day stories with no warning, but the sudden, purposeful closeness of an aircraft that should have been a dot and was instead a shape with rivets and exhausts. Each encounter revolved around the same short measure of time. The title's claim 45 seconds was never a promise. It was a ceiling, a hope, a best-case span for a seasoned crew on a clean sea. The truth, the Allies learned to exploit, was simpler and harsher. You do not need to sink the boat deep. You only need to meet it while it is still becoming a submarine. On 30 July 1943, that logic played out in bright daylight, when a Sunderland from an Australian squadron found a group of U-boats in the bay. There was no Leigh Light. There was the low, shallow-set attack, the sea lifting hard under the pattern the crash dive caught inside the dangerous envelope. One boat did not come home. The lesson was not new by then, only finished compress the fight into the first minute after alarm, and the ocean becomes small enough to aim. That is the stakes line of 1943. For the U-boat arm, the bay crossing has turned from transit to gauntlet. For Coastal Command, the war has become a problem of seconds and geometry, radar, and training nerves and airframes that can live at wave-top. Between them sits a window about 30 to 45 seconds wide that decides again and again whether steel is swallowed by depth or broken on the surface where everyone can see. They were feared because they chose the night and the surface. A Type 7 running on diesels at sea level was fast enough to overtake a convoy, its silhouette so low that whitecaps hid it, its lookouts trained to read the dark the way a hunter reads brush. Torpedoes were set and ready in the tubes. The bridge team rehearsed the sequence until it felt like a lullaby close in from the quarter. Fire a spread, turn away, disappear into black water before the escorts could react. Radio made it scale. Wolf packs formed on bearings passed by a controller ashore, so one sighting could become a dozen teeth. For years, that rhythm killed shipping by the million tons because the defenders were always a step late and a mile short. The counter-rhythm arrived with centimetric radar, high-frequency direction finding, and aircraft that could loiter over the air gap. Air-to-surface radar on patrol planes could see a wet periscope or a low hull at night at ranges that made human eyes irrelevant. Leigh Light slammed a cone of day onto a bridge that had trusted darkness, robbing the U-boat of the one sense that mattered: time. And time is all a crash dive, is the boat must turn heavy angle down, seal, steel to steel, and get its fragile skin just a little deeper than a shallow pattern of explosives will reach. The arithmetic is brutal. At the first shout, the klaxon wails. Men on the bridge drop into the conning tower and the hatch slams. Vents open to flood ballast and drive the bow under. Planes bite water to force the angle. 10 seconds vanish in bodies moving and iron closing. Another 10 go to flooding and trim, while the depth gauge creeps past 10 meters, still inside the killing envelope of a shallow-set pattern. In the third half-minute, the boat is neither here nor there. Hydrophones are deafened by its own water. Rush the hull groans as pressure climbs. The batteries have not yet taken the load of true underwater flight, and the captain has almost no choice but straight ahead, while the boat finds neutral. The attacker has already started his run. He does not aim where the submarine is. He lays his weapons across where the bow must be. if gravity and seawater have their say. When the first string lifts and the concussions slam through bulkheads, the men feel it in ears, teeth, and the joints of the boat. Even if the hull holds, the next pass is coming before order returns. The pattern repeated because the moves were standardized. Patrol planes approached dark until the last seconds snapped on Leigh Light to burn the bridge crew's night vision and dropped a bracket of shallow charges just ahead of the bow wave. If the boat was quick enough to get under the first pattern, the attacker shifted to a second act. A homing torpedo listened for screws and machinery and hunted a target that was still shallow, still noisy, still trying to level off. U-boat strengths, stealth at night, on the surface, choice of angle and moment, were inverted into a narrow, predictable maneuver through a corridor of fire. Crews felt the shift in their bodies long before the reports reached desks. The invisibility of the surface approach was gone. Men on the bridge flinched at imagined light, because too many times the real beam had seared their retinas, just as the hatch combing bit their shoulders. Crash dive drills lost their comfort, because every second had a weight. 2 seconds fumbled at a ladder, 3 seconds fighting a swelled gasket, 5 seconds for a man in a duffel to clear the hatch, each tiny delay translating into louder metal and thicker air below. The captain's hands lived on the plainsmen's backs, while the diving officer called depth in a voice shaved down to numbers. No one asked how deep, everyone asked how fast. The case studies made it plain this wasn't luck. On 30 July 1943 over the Bay of Biscay, a Sunderland of No. 461 Squadron RAAF, led by Flight Lieutenant Dudley Marrows, caught a group of U-boats on the surface, lit the lead with Leigh Light, and dropped a perfect pattern that blew U-461 apart. The boats beside her were mauled, trying to beat the same 45-second clock. A week later, in the Caribbean, U-615 under Capitan Lieutenant Ralph Kapitsky fought off repeated air attacks, tried to buy life with successive emergency dives, and still went under after the aircraft adjusted tactics run by run. Every attempt to reach safe depth was met by weapons tailored to the phase of the dive. In both fights, the physics of the first minute decided the day. Numbers on spec sheets only matter when translated to survival. The small radar cross-section that once kept a surfaced boat safe at night meant nothing to 10-centimeter radar. The sturdy pressure hull that saved lives at 100 meters could not help at 15 when fuses were set to tear water at that exact layer. Even the snorkel, a late answer added, noise vibration, and a telltale plume that turned concealment into compromise. What counted now was whether a crew could compress a perfect drill into less than the time it took a practiced pilot to roll in light the sea and drop steel along a curve he had memorized. This was not an accident. It was a window of 45 seconds that Allied airmen learned to turn into a sentence. Salt crust on the bridge, combing diesel breath in the wind. Then the Watchgänger stiffens and points, and the Watchgänger drops without a word. The Capitan Lieutenant follows boots hammering rungs, shoulders rasping steel. The hatch wheel bites home, and the alarm howls through the conning tower as the Leitender Ingenieur yanks flood levers and ballast drinks cold water. The bow dips, planes bite, the Obersteuermann feels the wheel go heavy, and the depth gauge trembles past 6, 8, 10 meters while ears pop and lamps jitter red. Somewhere aft a gasket squeals and someone curses and is gone, replaced by the dry clack of a relay and the groan of the pressure hull finding its first load. The scent is diesel cut with wet iron and battery acid, a taste of metal on the tongue. The old script says, "The sea will hide them before the enemy can fix the geometry," but the old script has holes, and the boat is still shallow and noisy and straight. Above the patrol, aircraft runs dark to the last seconds. The pilot holds low and steady. The navigator calls range off the 10-centimeter set. The radar operator sings a line of numbers. The Leigh Light operator's thumb hovers the bomb. Aimer paints an invisible bracket forward of where the bow must be, if physics is still true. There is no bravado on the intercom, only clipped steps of a drill that began on a warm tarmac hours ago, and now has an answer to a moving problem. The light goes on and night detonates into white, and the men in the tower flinch as if struck, because daylight has no right to exist here. Not now. not like a spear through water. The captain feels the boat shudder as the plainsmen force another degree of angle, and the engineer calls for trim and quiet and more flood, and the gauge crawls like a wounded thing toward 15. The bomb aimer releases, and the pattern walks the surface. Where the bow wave was a moment ago charges, sinking in a neat geometry meant to meet the arc of the dive. And the first concussions strike with a flat metallic violence that lives in teeth and knees, and the knuckles on the wheel. Dust shakes from paint, bulb filaments ring. A man loses the ladder and is snatched up by hands that do not have names right now, only tasks. The hydrophones are deaf under the local thunder, and the chief shouts to seal, to brace, to cut what does not keep you alive. The crew count compartments by reflex and feel the hull take a second tremor that is not a rupture. Not yet, but a promise. The Obersteuermann keeps the bow true, because at this depth a wild turn only spends what little silence remains. The captain says nothing except a single word that means too late, and the boat accepts it without comment, because steel does not care about language. The pilot is already through, throttle forward, nose up, call made, turn left 5, extend altitude, back eyes to instruments. The navigator marks the buoy. The wireless sends the contact. The bomb aimer resets. The light goes off. The cockpit returns to dim discipline. The second pass is arithmetic. Again the bracket adjusted for a boat, now a few meters deeper and a fraction slower, as water and gravity fight the batteries for command. If the first pattern did not break bones or seals, the next weapon listens. Instead of looking the torpedo armed to hear the screw note the hull, hum, the signature of a submarine still dragging noise through a thin layer. Down below, the ingenieur orders, a quieting that is mostly prayer pumps, choked off, fans killed, non-essential circuits, dark the boat held on the edge of neutral to bleed noise into stillness. But physiology will not be silenced, and men breathe and machines tick and the sea transmits both. The Horchgänger gets his hearing back in a wash of hiss, and then a line of engine rises and falls above and away and returns, and the crew imagine wings hitting the air like a saw, as the pilot rolls again, steady, steady, release. The pattern lands shallower this time to clip the stern. If the bow is deeper, and the shock lifts the flooring and drops it, and a gauge dies and a light stutters, and the captain decides in one heartbeat not to go deeper because depth, without control, is a grave, chooses instead a slow angle and a course change that will mean nothing if the listener in the second act hears them. The crew brace for the noise that hunts, and it arrives as a faint mechanical hunger that becomes certainty, and then impact not as a bang, but as a long tearing pressure that wrenches fittings and shoves air through teeth and makes lungs small. The boat slumps and rights, and the ingenieur reports frames still fair, and water where water does not belong, but not enough to drown yet. The captain's hand settles on a shoulder and squeezes once, and the boat stays in the dark trying to be stone. Above the crew in the patrol plane, run the checklist again without triumph, fuel check, altitude, call surface units, hold racetrack, watch for oil and bodies, plan for the next contact, because this is a shift roll light. Release procedure and not a story. Somewhere astern, another U-boat has been late by 4 heartbeats at the hatch, and the same light pins it in place, and the same pattern writes the same answer, and in the space between explosions, every man below understands that the 45 seconds he was promised by old hands now belongs to someone else. The change began at desks covered in plots and contact logs, not on a windswept bridge. Max Horton at Western Approaches stopped measuring success as ships delivered and started counting U-boats hunted. His order of battle shifted from passive screens clinging to convoys to mobile support groups that could detach, range out, and stay on a contact until the sea went flat. At the same time, John Slessor at Coastal Command treated night and weather as allies, not obstacles. Centimetric radar was now good enough to see a periscope feather and a wet conning tower, so policy caught up with physics. Across the ocean, the United States Navy's 10th Fleet, a headquarters with no ships, fused intelligence, routing and operations, so that a contact fixed by high-frequency direction finding could be handed to an aircraft in minutes and to a hunter-killer group by the next watch. None of this sounded dramatic on a communiqué. It moved needles quietly, sort, assign, prosecute. Once the decisions were made, they hardened into checklists. Air stations along the European fringe, and after the Azores opened across the former air gap, sent patrols that all looked alike on paper. A long-legged Liberator or Sunderland ASV Mk III warmed Leigh Light tested bomb racks loaded with shallow-set patterns, and a pair of Mk 24 torpedoes against the inevitable shallow dive. Briefings were narrow. You will not search for a submarine that has already beaten the first minute of the engagement. You will force the first minute to happen on your terms. Crews rehearsed the geometry of a Type 7 crash dive, as if it were their own aircraft's takeoff run. How far the bow must travel in 45 seconds, how deep the gauge will read when ballast finishes drinking, how long men on a bridge can fight gravity and still close a hatch. On the waterline, the surface escorts learned to fight by division of labour. Frederick Johnny Walker made a trade that doctrine had avoided for years. One ship holds contact with quiet bearings, another performs the attack, and both ships trust each other's clocks more than they trust any single instrument. Hedgehog allowed a forward throw without losing the sonar trace under a hull, and Walker's groups used it to make attack a sustained condition, not an event. The effect on the target was cumulative rather than theatrical. Even a boat that survived the first patterns could not shake the pressure. Reacquire approach project, repeat until battery, air, or morale failed. Intelligence and command wiring made the battles shorter and more frequent. HF, DF stations ashore, and on escorts took bearings on brief Wolfpack transmissions and cut the ocean into pie slices. Ultra-decrypts told where refueling would be and when. Weather flights drew the wind for aircraft that could lurk just outside expected tracks. A headquarters could, by late 1943, put a square around a submarine's likely position, and then keep aircraft flying that square down to the hour, handing off to a support group called in from the nearest convoy screen. The submarine's choices narrowed before anyone on its bridge knew it. Weapons and sensors were paired to phases of the target's behavior. A surfaced U-boat at night was to be treated as a target of opportunity. For radar and light approach, dark to within, a practiced range gate. Snap the sea into day with Leigh Light, and lay a shallow pattern forward of the bow to meet the dive. A diving boat that still made noise was a candidate for an acoustic torpedo designed to hear through the first messy minutes underwater when pumps, fans, and hurried orders left a signature. A boat that got deep and quiet was handed to escorts whose discipline was to ignore depth charges set off the stern and instead project explosives where the target would be, not where it had been. Every step was written down and taught until crew language shrank to verbs and numbers. Industry's role was not just quantity, but the kind of risk quantity allowed. Coastal Command could order every night patrol on a U-boat line to carry a light that weighed and dragged because production could support widespread fit and maintenance could swap unserviceable sets by the next sortie. American factories could send more long-range Liberators and more escort carriers than the Germans could replace boats and crews lost in the Biscay exits. A patrol that ended with a damaged aircraft and a confirmed kill was not an outlier to be conserved. It was a result to be repeated tomorrow by another crew in another airframe. On the German side, a veteran engineering petty officer or a seasoned watch leader was an irreplaceable asset. On the Allied side, a trained crew was valuable, but never unique. That asymmetry made aggressive standardization rational. Training material reflected the new math. Coastal Command notes captured the essence in a few lines: do not chase depth, bracket the dive. Bomb aimers carried tables derived from observed lunge rates of common types. Pilots learned to maintain a low, slight offset run that put the pattern in front of the bow wave rather than on top of it. Escort ships drilled the creeping attack until helmsmen could keep a course by feel, while the attacking consort homed on whispered bearings. When things went wrong, and in the Atlantic they often did, the recovery steps were themselves codified, so the formation remained in a hunting posture instead of dissolving into a search. The statistics that filtered back up the chain were grimly consistent. After Black May 1943, the number of patrols that ended with air sighting, followed by an immediate attack, went up, and the number of patrols in which a U-boat escaped by emergency dive went down. Boats fitted with snorkels later in the war presented a smaller surface target, but paid in speed, awareness, and noise. They were harder to catch at the moment of surprise, but easier to fix once located, and they lacked the offensive tempo that had justified their risk on the surface. Radio discipline orders reduced wolfpack coordination in exchange for survival, but fewer transmissions also meant fewer coordinated mass attacks on convoys. Every defensive adaptation purchased life at the price of the myth that U-boats owned the night. Within German commands, the language shifted from hunting to surviving. Orders discouraged extended surface shadowing of convoys after dark. Refueling rendezvous moved and shrank. Patrol lines were redrawn to avoid air coverage and found that air coverage moved with them. Captains who once sought the silhouette of a freighter at 0100 now sought a weather front and a gap in patrol cycles. For the Allied side, the language shifted as well, but in the other direction, from skill to method. A well-executed attack was praiseworthy. A by-the-book attack was expected. The point of all this was not to make every engagement a kill, but to ensure that every engagement started on Allied terms and restarted until the outcome matched the tables. By the winter, after the doctrine hardened, crews could move from briefing room to cockpit to contact with the confidence that each line of their checklist had been written for the first minute in which a submarine is least like a submarine, and most like a wounded ship. From that moment on, they did not hunt U-boats. They ran a 45-second production line for shutting them down. It breaks first at the surface where the myth was born. A bridge team that once read darkness like a map now reads a sudden white pillar driven down from a patrol plane that should not be there, not at that hour, not with that certainty. The hatch slams the alarm, claws the steel, and the ritual moves begin flood-trim planes on, yet the minutes they were taught have narrowed to seconds. The boat is still shallow when the sea walks under it in a neat pattern. The first concussion sits in the bones. The old belief, night plus surface, equals invisibility, and a practiced crash dive equals escape, meets a procedure that treats the first 45 seconds as a target shape. On the second run, the aircraft behaves like a metronome. There is no chase, there is phasing. Radar to light, light to bracket, bracket to homing. If the boat is still noisy, and it is because pumps and fans and shouted numbers make noise, the weapon that listens follows the wake of its own fear. The boat's captain has a decision set that has shrunk to posture, and hope holds shallow and quiet, and bleed noise into silence, or chase depth and hand the listener a longer line of sound. Either way, the first minute belongs to the attacker, not the attacked. Crews felt the doctrine before they read it. A week after one night's kill, another crew in another sea tried the same leap and met the same light. In Biscay, a lead boat broke open under a shallow bracket, while consorts were mauled trying to buy seconds their drills did not contain. In the Caribbean, a stubborn captain fought through pass after pass, and still went under when the second act arrived with a torpedo that did not need eyes. None of these were flukes. All of them mapped onto tables, quietly circulating through Allied stations. Average dive angles, time to periscope, depth expected, speed loss under ballast fuse settings that put steel where a bow must be if physics remains true. Above the waterline language thinned inside Allied aircraft. Range steady lights release. Coming around. Arm homing. Listen. Drop. Extend. There was no heroism to narrate because none was asked for. The virtues were timing and repetition. Below the waterline language thinned for different reasons. Hold seals, kill fans, count frames, shift weight. The Horchgenger's world is a hiss, regaining its edges after the first shock, then a line of engine note that fades and returns with a wing's bank. The Obersteuermann holds the bow true because tight turns by little at 12 meters. The Leitender Ingenieur turns systems into choices: what to silence that will not kill them, what to keep that will not betray them. In the dark, the body becomes an instrument. The ears gauge pressure, the teeth measure, shock the lungs, time the space between blasts. Command papers arrive later and say the same thing without salt or heat. Patrol behavior changes from shadow a convoy on the surface by night to avoid night surface exposure within air patrol arcs. Radio discipline orders cut wolfpack chatter to slivers, small enough that bearings are harder to take, but also small enough that coordination frays. Refit priorities migrate toward snorkels that promise permanence underwater and deliver compromise, less speed, less awareness, more vibration, and a plume that betrays when the sea is smooth. Routing shifts to weather and distance from airfields, and airfields move to meet it. A line in a staff circular admits the obvious, in a tone built for ledgers. Night surface operations in radar and searchlight zones are no longer viable. The effect on action is immediate. Skippers, who once wore aggression as policy, now treat survival as mission, when the first pattern lands too close. Damage control becomes a prelude to a decision many did not consider before 1943: bleed deeper and die quiet, or break surface and throw men to rafts. The rare surrender that follows a near miss acquires its own logic: save a trained crew that cannot be replaced, deny the enemy the kill, cycle's last step, live to write a report that narrows someone else's danger by a second. The mythology of the hunter that owns the night does not survive contact with arithmetic that starts at the moment a hatch wheel bites and ends at the moment a light turns sea into day. On the other side, the collapse has an institutional rhythm. Air stations replace smashed lights and bent racks, and launch again with a crew that has read the same card and flown the same approach. Escort groups keep contact through error and weather, because roles are separated and timing is agreed. If a pattern fails, it is not an indictment of doctrine, but a cue to turn and try the next step at the proper interval. Success is measured not by a dramatic detonation, but by the absence of new contacts on a plotted route, and the absence of returns from a boat expected to report that never does. The calm in after-action forms hides what the crews already know in their hands: this is repeatable. At the operational margin, the number of choices left to a submarine commander becomes a study in subtraction. Fewer safe refueling rendezvous, fewer radio minutes to assemble a pack, fewer gaps in the air net as the Azores and long-range aircraft close the last seams, fewer nights when a surface sprint to get ahead of a convoy is worth the cost of being seen. Many of the remaining choices are defensive and time-burning. None restore the freedom that made the weapon frightening in the first place. When the myth finally buckles, it does not do so with a headline. It breaks in the way watchstanding changes. Lookouts stop believing eyes will save them at 0200. Engineers stop trusting that a perfect crash dive will outrun a practiced run-in. Staff stop tasking boats to surface shadow outside air coverage and start calculating whether a patrol line will be ground down faster than it can bite. The language of hunting withers in logs, and the language of evasion grows. The night is still dark, the sea still wide, but the first minute of contact is now owned by a method that scales. After that, the pattern holds with cruel economy. Find light bracket. If not finished, listen and finish. If still not finished, hand to ships that attack without breaking contact. Each step acknowledges the same physics and the same human limits below. Allied crews do not celebrate. They record fuel and fly again. German crews do not argue. They carry their drills into a geometry that no longer yields life at the old rate. The legend of the quick escape by a clean dive shrinks to a memory told softly by men who survived on margin and luck, not doctrine. The night remains the night, but those 45 seconds are no longer theirs. Oil spreads in thin rainbows where the sea closed, and within hours the paperwork catches up to the shock. Aircrews land, refuel, and write clean after-action lines that fix the essential geometry radar to light, light to bracket, bracket to homing, handoff to ships if required. A sketch shows the curve of a Type 7's dive over 45 seconds and the shape of a shallow pattern laid just ahead of the bow. Photographs of froth and debris pinned to a board, and the operations officer underlines one sentence that matters more than wreckage: repeatable. Across the water, a signals room waits for a call sign that will not return. A short BDU note records loss of contact and adds the admonition, already becoming reflex: avoid night surface exposure, inside air patrol arcs. In the first 2 weeks, the habit spreads. Patrol schedules add more night lines across Biscay exits and mid-ocean corridors now bridged by long-range aircraft. Escort groups rotate to keep a hunter on station rather than attached to a single convoy. Contact to attack times shrink into minutes, because bearings and decrypts move through one fused chain of command. Briefings flatten to a single demand, force the first minute on your terms. Bomb aimers carry a card with dive rate tables. Pilots rehearse the low offset run until altitude and release become muscle. On the German side, radio discipline tightens to slivers that save boats and ruin coordination. Refueling rendezvous move into weather and distance. Drills emphasize silent, shallow running after first shock. In a few logbooks, a line appears that rarely did, before surfaced, surrender after damage. It is not common, but it is no longer unthinkable. By 3 months, the procedure has a life of its own. Coastal and 10th Fleet guidance writes the sequence into doctrine, not anecdotes. Leigh Light becomes a default fit. Homing torpedoes are allocated as the second act of every night contact. Escort ships treat Hedgehog as the primary strike. Not an experiment. Training syllabi absorb the dive geometry. Instructors demand timing and phasing instead of instinct and luck. Results filter upward as cold trend. More sightings converting to attacks, fewer emergency dives, buying escape, more boats forced into patterns of silence that prevent hunting even when they survive. On the other side of the ledger, snorkels appear in numbers sufficient to change behavior, but not to restore initiative. They keep steel underwater at the cost of speed awareness and a fresh seam of noise the enemy can learn. Orders that once sent captains to shadow a convoy on the surface now send them to live, then look. Material remains of the shift multiply. A coastal command diagram of a night run-in becomes the template for a dozen squadrons. A support group track map shows overlapping racetracks and creeping attacks that read like clock faces. A BDU circular, careful and bloodless acknowledges what crews already knew from the glare on their eyelids. Night surface operations in radar and searchlight zones are no longer viable. None of these papers speak loudly. All of them change how men move. The psychology settles in behind the paperwork. For Allied crews, fear becomes a checklist, and the checklist becomes confidence. They measure success in executions, not emotions. For German crews, the old certainty dissolves into conditions weather distance from air luck in the first minute. Conversation in a control room that once planned bites becomes a calculus of noise angle and whether to keep depth or keep men. The weapon that frightened because it chose the time now survives because it refuses one. What remains to argue is not whether the minute matters, but whether it could have been taken back. If snorkels had arrived in bulk 6 months earlier, would the 45 seconds have stayed a sentence or become a coin flip? If homing torpedoes had been rarer, would shallow brackets alone have forced the same retreat? Was the U-boat still good as a machine when it had already lost to a method that scaled? The answers sit in tables and wreck positions, and in the way patrol lines thinned after Black May. But the debate is worth the comment thread. Next, we follow the attempt to reclaim the night by artifice, the snorkel's promise of permanence underwater, and why its vibration, plume, and self-noise betrayed the very quiet it sought. The night is still dark, but the first minute now has an owner.